Testing. 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 Testing.
This hearing will come to order. This hearing is on development, diplomacy, and defense, promoting U.S. interests in Africa. And today we'll hear from the administration on U.S. policy in Africa. This is particularly timely, as tomorrow the administration will roll out a new Africa strategy. There is longstanding bipartisan consensus in Congress that the U.S. must be fully engaged on the continent of Africa. U.S. diplomacy and assistance saves lives, it increases our security, it builds capacity, it advances conservation, it spurs economic opportunity for both Americans and Africans. Africa is a continent of immense opportunity and challenge, blessed with tremendous resources, newly empowered consumers, entrepreneurial youth. In many places, this means significant potential for U.S. companies to increase their trade and investment. In other areas, however, despotic leaders continue to exploit power and pilfer resources for personal gain, ignoring pressing social and economic needs. Meanwhile, unfortunately, in some parts of Africa, terrorist groups and transnational criminal organizations have found safe haven in vast, ungoverned spaces. This committee has been at the forefront in responding to these opportunities and challenges. Landmark legislation like the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act and Electrify Africa have energized U.S. economic engagement on the continent, and more recently, the President signed into law the BUILD Act, which increases our ability to support private sector investment. These and other initiatives are helping the next generation of entrepreneurs and civil society leaders to create jobs in their communities and demand more accountability from their governments. Improved health, thanks in large part to programs like PEPFAR and the Global Food Security Act, means Africans are living longer and healthier lives. The committee has also been a leader in efforts to crack down on poaching and illicit trafficking so that elephants and rhinos and magnificent natural resources are preserved and local communities there benefit rather than be plundered by criminal and terrorist organizations. In tackling these challenges, we shouldn't engage with only the countries who are our friends. Our interests are diverse and continent-wide. We simply must work in the toughest places to defend these interests. And we know what happens when the U.S. fails to engage. We know who fills that void. It is China and Russia. They already are, by ramping up business investment, access to finance, arms sales, and military partnerships. Several of us on the committee have seen this firsthand. Last year, China opened its first permanent military base, co-located with the U.S. base in Djibouti. We must get this right. Our diplomatic, economic, and national security interests are at stake. We must deploy adequate resources to support our interests in Africa. We must continue, not back away from, building partner capacity to improve security, to foster trade, to foster economic development, strengthen health systems, combat wildlife trafficking, and support good governance. We must be steadfast in our support of the men and women, Americans and Africans, working to advance democracy, stability, peace, to ultimately create better lives. That's the foundation of an effective Africa strategy. And I'd like to thank my ranking member, Eliot Engel, as well as Chairman Chris Smith and Ranking Member Karen Bass of the Africa Subcommittee for their dedication to these issues. This is my last hearing as chairman of this committee. It has been the honor of a lifetime to work with my colleagues to strengthen our country and advance neoliberal values worldwide. I am forever grateful to your support. And lastly, I want to thank Staff Director Tom Sheehy and Chief of Staff Amy Porter, who are leaving the committee. They have been essential to our many successes. I now turn to the ranking member, Mr. Elliott Engel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for calling this hearing. As you mentioned, I'm guessing this will be the final hearing of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the 115th Congress. And Mr. Chairman, your final hearing as chairman, Ed. So this is a fitting subject to focus on because there's not a member of this body who has done more than you when it comes to American engagement across the African continent. Legislation to expand access to reliable electricity, to provide better sources of food and nutrition, to crack down on wildlife trafficking and the criminal networks responsible for it, to help foster growth, development, and stability. Bill after bill after bill passed through this committee and the Congress are now law, thanks to the leadership and vision of Chairman Ed Royce. And the committee's work on Africa has looked like the vast majority of the work this committee has done under Ed's chairmanship. It's been thoughtful, it's been bipartisan, it's reflected the commitment of this committee's members to push legislation that advances American interests and values, leaving politics aside. So Ed, let me just thank you for the way you've run this committee. If I'm elected chairman by the Democratic caucus, it's my full intention to handle things with the same sort of fairness and collegiality that you have. So I want to thank you for everything you've done. Thank you for being our colleague. Thank you for being our friend. And we have made the lives of countless people better because of your hard efforts. We always say that the Foreign Affairs Committee is the most bipartisan committee in Congress. And we always say that partisanship should stop at the water's edge. And that's what you and I have tried to do. And it's been a pleasure working next to you and working with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Turning to today's hearing, I want to welcome our witnesses. It's been rare in the last few years that we've had administration officials before the committee, so we hope this begins a new trend. So we're glad to see you. We've seen a number of promising developments in Africa lately. In Senegal, a new Millennium Challenge Corporation compact worth more than $500 million will help meet the growing demand for reliable electricity in one of Africa's fastest growing economies. In Ethiopia, after months of protests and a violent, destabilizing crackdown, a prime minister committed to reform has risen to power. We need to help sustain the momentum of the country's positive trajectory. Nigeria's elections planned for February of next year will be massively consequential. The progress Nigeria has made demonstrates the importance of continued American support for Nigeria's Independent National Electoral Commission and other organizations like it. At the same time, we're keeping an eye on some seriously troubling trends when it comes to human rights. In Uganda, the arrests and torture of opposition politicians, even as that country receives massive American counterterrorism assistance. In Tanzania, crackdowns on free speech and press, along with threats to the LGBTQ community. Cameroon's longtime leader, just elected to his 7th term, continues to cling to power in the face of a growing insurgency. In Zimbabwe, where July's elections were marred by fraud and intimidation, and where the government has shown little interest in enacting desperately needed reforms. So there are plenty of areas that demand our continued focus, and I think that we need to work hard to make sure that these things are taken care of. After the Nigerian army massacred 40 unarmed civilians, they tweeted a clip of the president suggesting our own military use lethal force against asylum seekers on our southern border. In August, the president tweeted a white nationalist conspiracy theory that offended our partners in South Africa, a country to which he has nominated an ambassador. And in January, the president referred to African countries in general using a term that I won't repeat here. So these words send a troubling message, but our country's actions are even more important. And that's why I am opposed to the administration's trying to slash funding for global health efforts. The outgoing Ebola outbreak in the DRC's North Kivu province is the 2nd largest in history, and the region is so unstable that we've had to withdraw CDC personnel from the area. This crisis underscores why strong funding for global health is so critical. We want countries to be able to stop epidemics quickly and effectively. effectively, hopefully before they start, and definitely before they reach our shores. So we can't go along with fewer resources, and it troubles me that the administration seems to be pushing in that direction. And broadly speaking, we should not have a foreign policy of withdrawal and isolation, because we leave a void that our adversaries are only too happy to fill. Africa is a prime example. If we fail to stay engaged, there's no doubt that China and Russia will swoop in and exert influence. In my view, we simply cannot let that happen. So I'm eager to hear from our witnesses about how we're going to advance American interests and values in this critical region. Mr. Chairman, I thank you again, and I want to point out the wonderful work that Karen Bass and Chris Smith have done in order to get to the point where we're really making a difference in people's lives. So thank you again. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Engel. I appreciate it, Elliot. So this morning, I'm pleased to welcome the Honorable Tibor Nagy, Jr. and Mr. Ramsey Day to the committee. Ambassador Tibor Nagy currently serves as Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs. Prior to his appointment, he served as U.S. Ambassador to Ethiopia, Ambassador to Guinea, and as the Deputy Chief of Mission in Nigeria. In total, Ambassador Nagy has 20 years of experience working across Africa. Ramsey Day is with us, currently serving as the Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator for Africa at USAID. Previously, Mr. Day was the Senior Director for the Center for Global Impact at the International Republican Institute. He has held numerous positions within the international development and foreign policy communities, both in the United States and various overseas posts. And so we appreciate you both being with us today. Without objection, the witnesses' full prepared statements will be made part of the record. Members will have 5 calendar days to submit any statements or questions or extraneous material for the record. Before proceeding, I would like to take a moment and recognize in the audience Flori Leiser of the Corporate Council on Africa for her steadfast leadership to increase trade and investment in Africa. Troy Fittrell, who worked as a fellow on this committee, is just back from serving as Deputy Chief of Mission in Addis Ababa. Kathleen Moody of the State Department, who has been working on African issues for as long as I have. Tony Carroll, who's with us, former Peace Corps, who's testified in front of this committee before on Africa. So, and we see many other old African hands in the audience here as well. So it's great to have you here with us in the audience. And so, Ambassador Nagy, I'd ask you, please summarize your remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, members of the committee for the opportunity to testify today on U.S. policy towards Africa, and to my colleague and friend Ramsey Day of USAID here with me today. I also want to express my gratitude, and on behalf of the Africa Bureau at the State Department, to Chairman Royce for his decades of service to Africa, Africa relations, and other members for your longstanding interest in Africa. Today's hearing comes at an opportune time. We are at a critical juncture for the relationship between the United States and the nations and people of Africa. Africa faces an uncertain and challenging, but by no means predetermined future. The choices we make now will affect not only our relationship with the continent, but will have ramifications worldwide. Africa is facing a demographic tsunami. Its population will double by 2050 to around 2.5 billion people, 50% of whom will be under the age of 24. Challenges with infrastructure, corruption, and terrorism continue, and China is asserting itself on the continent economically, militarily, and politically. We must remain a positive alternative and make clear that engaging with the United States will mean greater prosperity and security for Africa. I am very fortunate to be in my current position. Virtually my entire career centered on Africa, much of it living there in 8 different countries. Since my first diplomatic assignment 40 years ago, Africa has changed dramatically. I recently concluded 2 trips to the continent in West Africa and East Africa, where I also addressed the African Union. Let me assure you of this: our potential with Africa is limitless. With every challenge, there is opportunity, and we must capitalize on our successes. Here, I would like to articulate some of the focus areas of the Bureau of African Affairs. First, we are promoting stronger trade and commercial ties between the United States and Africa, working with our African partners to build a level playing field across the continent's markets. African governments need to increase transparency and fairness in their commercial environments to attract more business and have predictable policies, laws conforming to international standards, and a credible dispute resolution process. Second, more than 60% of sub-Saharan Africa, or 600 million people, is below the age of 25, representing 40% of sub-Saharan Africa's unemployed. We are working to match American investment and ingenuity with the dynamism and entrepreneurial spirit of young Africans, anchoring them to their countries and keeping them from resorting to migration, militancy, or crime. A third area is working to advance peace and security through partnerships with African governments and effective regional mechanisms. Finally, we are focused on countering the Chinese narrative and setting the record straight. The United States has a long-standing commitment to Africa as a partner positively supporting economic growth, good governance, rule of law, enhanced gender equality, and the health of the African people. Let me begin with the promotion of stronger trade and investment ties. Everywhere I speak to an African audience, I emphasize we seek to do business not just in Africa, but with Africa. Our promotion of free trade agreements with the United States communicates to Africans that transparency, fairness, and good governance attract U.S. investment, and we hope to negotiate a first-ever free trade agreement with a sub-Saharan African country. Trade has greatly expanded. Under the African Growth and Opportunity Act from 2000 to 2016, U.S. investment in sub-Saharan Africa increased from $7 to $29 billion, providing opportunities for hundreds of thousands of Africans. Since 2000, U.S. exports to Africa rose from $6 to more than $14 billion last year, and U.S. imports from Africa totaled nearly $25 billion, a total two-way trade of $39 billion in 2017, up 5.8% from 2015. The U.S. Millennium Challenge Corporation provides assistance to the world's poorest countries who demonstrate commitment to good governance, economic freedom, and investing in their citizens. This week, I attended a ceremony with Secretary Pompeo where MCC and the government of Senegal signed a $550 million compact that will modernize Senegal's power sector to increase economic growth and reduce poverty through improved access to electricity. The BUILD Act, and thank you very much to Congress for the BUILD Act, which President Trump signed into law in October with strong bipartisan support, will establish the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation. This new law consolidates, modernizes, and reforms the U.S. government's development finance capabilities. Africa is the largest regional exposure, totaling more than $6 billion, and the BUILD Act will help mobilize additional private sector investment. With our second focus, we go beyond investing in Africa to invest in Africans. Through the Young African Leaders Initiative, or YALI, we equip the next generation of Africans with leadership and entrepreneurship skills. The YALI Network, a virtual community of more than 500,000 members, helps young Africans develop skills and connections needed to make change in their communities. Our third focus, promoting peace and security, is essential to secure Africa's opportunities and prosperity. We support African-led efforts against terrorism and other transnational threats. U.S. assistance has brought some success in the Lake Chad region, Somalia, and elsewhere, and we seek burden-sharing opportunities with non-African actors as well. We have provided training to peacekeepers from more than 20 African countries with substantial impact. 10 years ago, Africans comprised only 40% of the continent's peacekeepers. Now that figure has exceeded 60%. U.S.-funded programming is vital to these forces as it is to the G5 Sahel Joint Force and African-driven efforts in the Lake Chad region to counter terrorism in West Africa. Our African partners are working to ensure stability and defeat terrorist organizations in East Africa as well. The AMISOM mission, composed of regional states, is helping Somalia become more stable and prosperous, and we are providing development and security assistance to the Somalis who can govern themselves. Additionally, we support efforts by African partners to strengthen their maritime and border security and their efforts to address trafficking in arms, drugs, and wildlife. Finally, We want to be clear to all Africans that the United States has an unwavering commitment to the continent, shown through our longstanding partnerships and support for good governance, security, human rights and economic growth, and provision of humanitarian assistance. African countries should know that some infrastructure projects and seemingly attractive loan terms from other countries can lead down a dangerous path to indebtedness, loan defaults, and concessionary extraction of natural resources, stifling the economic growth needed to create jobs. In contrast, the United States is pursuing sustainable alternatives for African growth and development. U.S. programs like AGOA, PEPFAR, Power Africa, and Feed the Future opened the U.S. market to African goods, countered HIV/AIDS, brought electricity to rural areas, protected vulnerable women and children, supported youth entrepreneurship, and helped Africans in innumerable ways. As we continue to engage with Africa, we must assess how to best work with each country and multilateral institution to advance our mutual interests and priorities. The State Department cannot do this alone. We need to continually synchronize our approach among all elements of national power. Only by balancing resources among development, diplomacy, and defense can we speak with a coordinated voice to the governments and the people of Africa. I do not exaggerate when I say Africa is the continent of the future, but a future envisioned by Africans and not one seen as forced upon them. And success must ultimately come from developing African solutions to African problems. We must look at Africa through the windshield, not through the rearview mirror. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I look forward to your support as our nation continues our engagement with Africa.
Thank you, Ambassador. Mr. Day. And free, Mr. Day, to just summarize those remarks. Try to keep to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, sir.
Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, members of the committee, I'm grateful for the opportunity to testify before you today. I'd like to extend a special thank you to the committee and your colleagues in Congress whose long-time bipartisan commitment to the peoples of the African continent provides the foundation for USAID programs and the springboard for their success. And while challenges remain, I truly believe that Africa's future is bright. The investments and commitment of the American people to the people of Africa are paying off, and USAID has set its priorities to capitalize on the region's emerging opportunities. Under Administrator Green's leadership, USAID is focusing its resources in places where the conditions are right to establish and sustain progress. U.S. assistance in Africa certainly saves lives, and it also spurs trade and investment and advances peace and security. Take the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, or PEPFAR. This program is a powerful expression of the compassion and generosity of the American people. In 2016, a PEPFAR assessment showed the first evidence of the epidemic becoming controlled in 3 key African countries, Malawi, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. These same countries have reduced the new HIV infections by as much as 76% since the start of the PEPFAR program. And with continued focus, the U.S. government is poised to help control the HIV epidemic in 10 African countries over the next 4 years. The United States is also the world's leading humanitarian donor. USAID provides humanitarian assistance across the continent, including in Nigeria, South Sudan, and Somalia, where conflict and instability are fueling food insecurity and displacement. USAID experts have also been deployed to the Democratic Republic of Congo, or DRC, to help respond to the current Ebola crisis. But even as USAID mobilizes the best of American generosity, we also work to prepare for future shocks and equip countries with the tools they'll need to feed themselves. USAID is also highly focused on the immense trade and international investment opportunities, which we believe is the fastest way for Africa to boost its economic growth, which is in the interest of the United States. We believe that African nations can tap the trillions of dollars in private sector resources needed to advance the continent's development and ultimately eliminate the need for unsustainable foreign-backed loans. One area where we're using a market approach or private sector engagement is the power sector, an area where we greatly appreciate Chairman Royce's leadership with the enactment of the Electrify Africa Act. Power Africa, a whole-of-government effort led by USAID, employs a partnership approach to engage U.S. government agencies, international donors, and finance institutions, host country counterparts, and, of course, the private sector. Power Africa has helped add over 12.5 million new electrical connections, which means more than 57 million people have access to electricity who did not have access prior to the initiative's launch. USAID's trade and investment hubs in Africa are helping to transform African economies and deepen the U.S.-Africa trade and investment relationship. They reduce regional trade barriers and promote trade and investment under the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, or AGOA, legislation that this committee championed. The trade and investment hubs have also directly leveraged $1.3 billion in African exports under AGOA, and many of the jobs that have been created are held by women, who tend to invest job-related income into their families and communities. However, we can't talk about successful economic future for African countries without addressing peace and security. USAID works with our African partners to address the underlying factors that allow transnational crime, violent extremism, and internal conflict to flourish. Working in partnership with African governments and civil society, our support strengthens institutions, protects the democratic gains that have been made all across the continent. USAID is also combating the threat of wildlife trafficking in countries across sub-Saharan Africa. USAID and its partners are making it more difficult for people to poach, move, and sell wildlife products across borders. This helps secure our natural resources and fight the criminal networks that threaten security and the rule of law and ultimately undermine development progress. Our focus is on helping countries on their journey to self-reliance. USAID's goal is to end the need for foreign assistance. As Administrator Green has said, it's our core belief that each country must lead its own development journey. We're focusing on the ending the need for foreign assistance, not because we wish to retreat from our friends, but because we believe in them. If a country is willing to take on the difficult journey to self-reliance, we want to walk alongside them along that journey. At USAID, we are looking towards the day when the transition to a new kind of relationships that move beyond traditional assistance, an enduring relationship in which countries move from recipients of aid to partners to even fellow donors. And on a personal note, I'm truly honored to be here today. I'm deeply committed to USAID's goals and the integrated role that USAID plays with the Department of State, as well as the Department of Defense in advancing U.S. policy and national security objectives. So thank you for the opportunity to be here, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Day. Let me bring up some testimony last December. Deputy Secretary Sullivan and Department of Defense Undersecretary Trachtenberg testified that as terrorist groups are facing defeats in the Middle East, we are seeing activity increase and expand elsewhere, including and especially in Africa. So we know that terrorist groups benefit from poor governance and instability, which is present in parts of Africa. And we know that terrorists abroad pose a direct threat to U.S. interests, even here at home. The State Department leads on our counterterrorism efforts through Train and Equip Authority and other law enforcement capacity programs. The committee's work to ensure that this remains the case, and I know it's been reported that the administration intends to shift to combating great power competition in Africa and shift away some from the robust counterterrorism engagement that we've had our eye on here. And I wanted to ask you, Ambassador, how will this shift in priorities impact our progress towards building the capacity of partner nations in Africa to counter these dangerous security threats themselves?
Thank you very much, Chairman. During my last 2 trips to the continent, just concluded a couple of days ago, that is one of the questions and one of the issues that I looked into extensively, both in discussions with the host government. Also, I stopped off both in London and Paris to discuss with some of our allies some of those considerations. And this time, I was with AFRICOM Commander General Waldhauser, both in Ethiopia, and then I stopped off in Stuttgart to have extensive discussions there. And I also visited Camp Lemonnier in Djibouti, again, to discuss that various issue. And while I have to leave any details and specifics to the Department of Defense, I just want to assure you that that is at the top of our list and discussions to make sure that we continue to move forward with the counterterrorism. Because as you say, it is extremely problematic. Also, during my time in West Africa, I had held discussions with the Prime Minister of Togo and with the President of Guinea, and both the Guineans and the Togolese now are concerned over the terrorism seeping into their own countries from the previous area in the Sahel. So I assure you that issue is very much front and center, and we are going to continue focusing on it and coordinating with our friends in AFRICOM.
I understand, but I reached out to the Department of Defense, and they're not here today. And so it falls on you
Yeah.
to convey to us the intentions here, because this committee is going to continue to have a focus on exactly this issue. But I'll ask both of you, we've got to engage with countries across Africa, even the most challenging countries, with which we have significant differences. Too many policy priorities, frankly, depend on it. You know better than we do just how true this is, just as we're dealing now in Congo with the Ebola crisis in the East. So, if we were to take an example of wildlife trafficking, we have a tenuous relationship with a number of East and Central African countries, yet we support their park rangers. We support their law enforcement agencies to combat poaching and trafficking. We're trying to enforce the bill we passed here to abolish the ivory trade, right? So if we shift away from working with challenging nations, what happens to these partnerships? I'd like to hear you articulate, Ambassador, and Mr. Day as well, what the intent here. I haven't seen the plan rolled out yet, so I'd like to hear your thoughts on this.
Sorry. Exactly, Chairman. The partnerships in those critical areas will certainly go on. We have both a bilateral strategy, and we will continue our discussions with AFRICOM with a region-wide strategy. During my just visit to Stuttgart, we discussed some of these very issues, both for the Sahel, for Lake Chad, for East Africa, Somalia, for Djibouti, and then also especially for providing for the safety and security of U.S. personnel and properties throughout Africa. So again, I can't give you any specifics, but I can assure you that that is an ongoing discussion. We had a general meeting here with AFRICOM several weeks ago. I met with the entire AFRICOM staff when I was in Stuttgart, had the same discussions in Djibouti, at Camp Lemonnier, so that goes on
My
country
time's
by
expired,
country.
so we'll follow up
Absolutely.
afterwards with you. Karen Bass of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Let me just begin by saying that, one, I want to join in on with my colleagues to thank you for your leadership and say that it's particularly meaningful that you chose your last hearing to be on this region of the world. And I just wanted to take note of that and to let you know that when I'm in the community or in the press or whatever, when they're always attacking us for never working on a bipartisan basis, I always use this committee, and I especially talk about your leadership as over these years you've always led this committee in a bipartisan way, and you'll be missed. But I'll also put you on notice that you are from Southern California, as am I, and so you might be retiring from Congress, but I don't intend to let you just retire. I'll be calling on you, in other words. Let me fire off a series of questions and then leave it to the two of you to respond. You mentioned, Ambassador, about AGOA, and I appreciate you mentioning that because, you know, a number of African countries are getting concerned with a push toward free trade agreements, that what does that mean for AGOA? And especially, you know, recognizing that some countries might be ready, but others aren't. And so what does the future of AGOA hold? In terms of elections coming up, you know, we have DRC in just a couple of weeks. We have Nigeria in February, and want to know what role we are playing, and particular concern in DRC. And you mentioned, Mr. Day, about Ebola and that we're there, but it was my understanding that CDC is not allowed there, and so maybe you can respond to that. So if you two could respond to both of those.
Thank you very much. On AGOA, I want to make it clear that AGOA goes on for another 5 years.
Right.
So we have that time to figure out how we want to move beyond it, because we do want to move beyond it. Up to now, I didn't even know this until I came back to to work in the diplomatic stuff. We don't have any free trade agreements with Sub-Saharan Africa.
Right.
The only one we have on the African continent is with
Morocco, right.
Meanwhile, the Africa Union is heartily pursuing the continent-wide free trade agreement, which we
Yes.
totally support. We think that's a phenomenal idea, and hopefully at some point, you know, we can engage with them through that format. But right now, and this is of special interest to me, we would like to start with one sub-Saharan country to explore a model free trade agreement that we can then perhaps expand on with other countries. We've had about a handful of countries come to us and ask specifically to engage with them.
So let me, and I'm sorry, I'm going to have to cut you off to make sure I can cover it all. Sure. In those 5 years, you know, we know that a lot of countries are not even taking, aren't even able to utilize AGOA.
Exactly.
But we might think about a two-tiered approach, because for AGOA to just go away in 5 years doesn't seem to make sense. But could you respond to the
Elections?
DRC? Yes.
Absolutely, okay. In Nigeria, when I visited Nigeria, I specifically looked at what we were doing on the elections, and I was so proud of Ambassador Symington and his mission. They engage with everybody. They send everybody everywhere. He had me meet with the National Electoral Commission chair. He had me meet with the chairs of both parties, asked them to sign a peace agreement. Last night, President Buhari and his party did sign a peace agreement.
Right. DRC?
DRC, 2 weeks to go. Some major concerns remain, especially with the voting machines. They have 100,000 voting machines coming. We will see. They have a great opportunity to have the first peaceful transition of power since 1960.
Okay, and there are also some signaling that maybe the elections are premature too, so coming from both sides, which we know that that's false, but just to flag that.
It is false. Hopefully, I see no reason why they cannot go forward.
Ebola in DRC?
On Ebola, thank you for the question, Congresswoman. We are deeply concerned about the Ebola outbreak in the DRC. This is the 10th outbreak. It is the largest we've seen.
Is CDC allowed?
The security environment in the immediate area of Bennytown is not permissible for U.S. government employees, but we do, USAID in partnership with CDC and WHO and the Ministry of Health of the government of DRC we have contractors on the ground, and we're working in partnership.
So what are we doing specifically then? We're providing what?
So we're doing everything from disease surveillance, case management, risk communications, ensuring that information is getting out properly.
And you can let me know later who our partner is that we have on the ground there?
Of course.
Thank you.
Mr. Chris Smith of New Jersey.
Thank you very, very much, Mr. Chairman. I do want to join Elliot Engel and other members of the committee in thanking you for your extraordinary leadership, especially on Africa. As former chairman of the committee, thank you for that leadership, but it continues to this moment. So thank you, Ed. Great job. I want to welcome our two very distinguished witnesses, thank them for their leadership as well, and Greg Simpkins, our former staff director on the subcommittee, working over at USAID on behalf of the continent. Let me just ask very quickly some questions. The festering crisis in Cameroon, Ambassador Naj, you had said that the last thing we need is a growing radicalization in response to the actions of security forces. You compared it to the response to Boko Haram and how that actually caused it to worsen, not get better. You might want to please speak to that and what we're doing to try to mitigate that danger. Congratulations on the breakthrough with Ambassador Yamamoto being deployed to Somalia. Your historic meeting in Eritrea, which I think is just incredible. You might want to comment on that briefly. You know, Karen Bass and I visited Ethiopia and met with Prime Minister Abiy in Addis last August. We're very impressed. We held a follow-up hearing about what we thought were significant progress, release of prisoners and all. Obviously, there's so much more to be done. Please, if you could spend a little time on that. On the issue of China, we know that China is attacking the dollar as the world's reserve currency. And of course, if that goes, our ability to hold countries to account is diminished, it's lessened. 14 African countries met in Zimbabwe in early spring, talking about looking at the yuan as a potential reserve currency. A few months ago, African leaders met in Beijing and were offered some $60 billion in financing, which shows, and we know what they're after. They're after minerals, they're after wood, they're after fossil fuels, and the spread of a bad governance model under Xi Jinping, who is cracking down in his own country on Muslims. I just had a hearing on the Uyghurs, the fact that 1 million people are now in concentration camps in Xinjiang, the autonomous region. Just the wrong country to be partnering with African countries, given the fact that their abuse of human rights almost has no, maybe North Korea has very few parallels anywhere in the world. So if you could speak to this Chinese influence, I know there's not much time, but on those issues and on chemonics, we did have a hearing, and the subcommittee and the full committee has been an oversight on the lateness of ARVs. You know, if you're late, that could be a death sentence. Is that being rectified, Mr. Day? But Ambassador.
Thank you, sir. I'll make this as quick as possible. On Cameroon, not much improvement. We were hoping that after the election of President Biya, he would make some moves to open up some dialogue with the Anglophone provinces. He has not. Extremely disappointing. The problem goes on. We continue to engage, but right now, unfortunately, not much optimism, just pessimism. On Isaias, absolutely, I spent 2 hours with the president. Extremely interesting points of view on the region. I hope that it leads to further discussion because, of course, we continue to have our bilateral problems with Eritrea, and hopefully we can resolve them in the future going forward. But Eritrea is one of the key participants in the region, and thanks to Prime Minister Abiy for opening up that political space. Yes, sir, your views on Ethiopian Prime Minister are right on. I had a chance to engage with him as well. He's continuing to move forward energetically, not getting much sleep at night. So let's hope for the best with him on both his external and his internal changes. On China, very interesting. I engaged about China with all of my contacts and with the business communities at all of my stops. I do have to say that I think the bloom is finally starting to wear off as countries realize that China represents a lot of debt, not much employment created, and not necessarily the types of companies and business environments that they want, especially the young people. I think if the United States can capture the young people, I'll leave the venal autocracy to the Chinese, and I'll stop there.
Thank you, Congressman. On the program that you're referencing, the Global Health Supply Chain, I'll get the latest status on I know there was a report that was released last month, but I would like to say that we certainly appreciate the oversight role that the committee plays, and we're absolutely committed to ensuring the highest standards of accountability. So, but I'll get a status on the report.
Finally, I just want to thank the President. Yesterday, he signed into law a 5-year reauthorization of PEPFAR. And obviously, you know, I was here, many of us were here when George W. Bush and our former chairman, Henry Hyde and Tom Lantos, led the effort for what is now, in my opinion, the most successful global health initiative ever anywhere in the world. It has ended largely the pandemic. 16 to 17 million people's lives have been saved. 2 million kids have been born without HIV/AIDS, which they probably would have gotten as they were being born through mother-to-child transmission. So congratulations on that signing yesterday, and thank you, and I yield back to
Mr. Brad Sherman of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It has been an honor to serve with you, and I want to join the praise from the entire chorus here. And Ambassador, I'm thrilled to see you here, not out of personal respect, although I certainly have personal respect for you, but an administration witness who is actually confirmed and not holding the position temporarily. It's been 2 years since I remember that occurrence. Uganda is one of the largest recipients of U.S. security assistance. Bobby Wine is free but still has this charge held over him. Has the United States made it clear to the government and Museveni that we're watching how Bobby Wine is treated?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, I met with the Angolan Prime Minister on the margins of the United Nations and underlined that fact and a number of other
Say
concerns.
the Angolan?
Pardon me? The Ugandan Prime Minister on the margins of the United, and underline that fact very strongly. We continue to do that with our engagements. Unfortunately, President Museveni shows no signs of thinking about a transition, and unfortunately,
I want to move on Uganda to talk about the North Korean contractors to their security forces. Obviously, the North Koreans don't bring a dedication to the rule of law and conduct of military operations in a humane manner. The Wall Street Journal did a major report on this just a few days ago and says, in part, U.S. officials say that Trump administration has been instructed to remain quiet on North Korean involvement in Uganda over concern that speaking out would undercut the image of an effective sanctions regime. Have you been instructed to, or I'll put this in the positive, can you now speak out against and describe what the North Koreans are doing in Uganda?
absolutely, Congressman. Our instructions are, and it's always included in our points of engagement with all governments in Africa, to urge them to comply with all Security Council resolutions to minimize.
Is Uganda complying?
I cannot answer that technically. I can get back to you on that. I don't want to give you the wrong answer. I do know that we urge them at
Given
every
the
opportunity.
importance of the North Korean nuclear program, how would that not be something you would already have an opinion on? I know the chairman has already answered the question for us. I'll yield to him.
I don't want to say that they are compliant right now if they are not, but I will double check that and get back to you. But I can assure you that that is one of our strongest points in every engagement with every African government.
China is using this debt trap. They've used it in Sri Lanka, where they offer and then say, well, you didn't pay, so we're taking this or that over. And these are sovereign countries, so they could simply say, no, we're not going to pay, and no, you're not going to take our port. The problem they have is that American and other financial institutions would regard that as a default. I wonder if you could work with me and perhaps others on this committee to establish an international financial order where if you don't pay a China debt trap debt, your FICO score still remains at 800. That there's basically no harm, no foul. What can we do to make it plain to the financial markets that it is simply illegal for them to count against a country its failure to pay one of these debt trap debts to China?
I would look forward to further discussions on that and see exactly what we could do, because that's the last thing we also want to do is see these countries get into that trap.
And I assume the State Department could look at individual deals, identify which ones constitute this debt trap financing, and declare that those are particular debts with the non-payment of which should not be considered by any financial institution doing business in the United States. Finally, Human Rights Watch has reported that the government of Tanzania is shutting down basically everything involving the LGBTQ community. What is our approach to protect the community in Tanzania?
Our approach is to raise our extreme concern with that, to engage with civic society, every means that we can possibly do that to protect them, because Tanzania is closing political space everywhere.
Thank you.
Mr. Rohrabacher of California.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and congratulations to you for making it through this difficult assignment of being the chairman of this committee. And I know I've made it a little more difficult myself for you at times, but we certainly appreciate your effort and those of Elliot. You've been a good team and done good things for America and the world. So let me just suggest that the job that our witnesses have had to do has been equally difficult, in that trying to balance off stability with reform and progress in Africa has got to be one of the most daunting tasks of any group of our professionals that are out there in our foreign service. And I would note that I'm going to mention a couple of negative things, but let me just say that that does not mean that I don't also recognize the positive things. I think one of the worst things that we have done in our country in terms of Africa is when our government suggested to Ethiopia that they could negate and they could just ignore the arbitration of the fight between Ethiopia and Eritrea. That did more to undermine peaceful solutions in Africa than anything I've seen in my lifetime. And the fact is that the peace between Ethiopia and Eritrea seems to be something that came from within and not something that we actually pushed on. In fact, the repression and the corruption of the Ethiopian government over the years was not ended because we, the United States, pulled back from that corrupt and repressive regime. Instead, it came from within, even when there were signs for all of us. That I don't think that, I would hope that we learn from that we should really be supporting reformers as came to power in Ethiopia via a people's movement. And the signs of corruption were everywhere in Ethiopia before the current government, before the current Abiy came forward and led his people towards peace with Eritrea and actually reforms. Let me note that for years I have been active in the pressuring Ethiopia to try to give back the property, especially the property of Americans, that was confiscated by the Ethiopian government. Now, the chairman and I have a family in Orange County, which we represent, the Brahani family, who owned some very important and valuable assets, property in Ethiopia, and the Ethiopian government in the past never gave it back. And that's because some people were profiting from that. And I'm afraid that I think that we should have been much more aggressive on that. And I would hope the Ethiopian government, the current government, moves on this problem, because we have an American family whose property is not being returned. And that's wrong, and it's should be a symbol to us that Ethiopian government is not going to be or will be corrupt. We're going to watch to see what happens there and other pieces of property. And to the degree that we had OPIC even denied Ethiopia the right to have OPIC funds until that and other issues were resolved, I suggest we continue that, but I would hope we can discard that type. I would hope that we can discard all of those pressures on Ethiopia and Eritrea and promote their peace and progress rather than looking at their faults. But it's up to them to give us the sign that they mean real reform. I would, as I say, what can we do? We just had some reference to China and how that makes these countries vulnerable, and I want to add to that. But what can we do that would prevent corruption in these African countries? What can we do to regulate our own bankers not to profit by taking money that was earned by corruption in these African countries?
Thank you very much for that. In my view, the best thing we can do is encourage civil society, because they are a great watchdog on government wrongdoing. Sir, in many of these countries, there has not been a tradition of any kind of civil society. And governments, especially corrupt governments, are scared to death of civil society. That's why they often go after them and try to close the political space, exactly because they hold them accountable. And also, of course, a free and vigorous press, because the media tends to be a wonderful watchdog as well. And then a level playing field so that other businesses besides the ones from the large country in East Asia have an equal chance at contracts and dispute resolution. Thank you, sir.
Greg Meeks, New York.
Mr. Chairman, I want to join the chorus in thanking you for your leadership as chairman of this committee and the way that you've conducted yourself. And I do think it says a lot about this hearing being your last, to show your continued focus on the continent. I've traveled with you several times to the continent, have seen firsthand, and I was so inspired by what you do on this committee, I decided to take your old office. Thank you gentlemen, for being here. I actually just came back from South Africa with Global Citizens. and they had pledges to raise worldwide $7 billion as a result of what they're doing to eradicate poverty by 2030, and moving quite briskly and trying to get attention, particularly to the continent of Africa, as to what we need to do. Unfortunately, oftentimes, as just happened at this time while I was in Africa, I ask about U.S. involvement, U.S. investment, U.S. trade, and they're saying that they don't see enough of us. And so they have to deal with the individuals that seem to have interest. Oftentimes that has been China. And so I know, as you've indicated, you know, how Africa's on track to have 25% of global population in just 30 years. I believe that leveraging the resources of the U.S. government to support greater private sector investments, which I think is key, is a win-win. And so from your perspective, you know, especially with the DFI's ability to make equity investments in Africa, will it encourage U.S. financial investors, such as pension funds, because that's, you know, we get everybody to scale up their investments alongside the new DFI, putting it together, working in a combination way to help our presence and make a difference and have some real equity investments in Africa.
Thank you, sir. Absolutely. I have found so much enthusiasm amongst American businesses wanting to take their money to Africa because they have so much money available right now looking for a place. And at the same time, in all my travels, I found the African governments equally enthusiastic, wanting to bring U.S. businesses, because U.S. businesses offer something totally different than what Chinese investors do. That's why I really want to thank you all for the BUILD Act, because I think it finally puts some arrows in our quiver that we didn't have before, because it offers, with its $60 billion plus the possibility of equity investment, it offers opportunities that we've not had before. And I can tell you that the U.S. business community in Africa is enthusiastic about it, and all of the African governments we engaged with really wanted to know more about it. So we're going to energize our embassies to be there, to come up with bankable projects and to engage directly. And I told the African governments, I can push U.S. businesses, but they need to do the pulling by putting in place environments that actually welcome and are fair to U.S. businesses. Thank you, sir.
And we need to work and continue that, because I know even if you go to, you know, looking at the work of China doing in there, but even in China, China looks at the U.S. businesses, at least the Chinese, they would want to work for our big companies in China. So I know what we can do a better job in Africa than what we have. And also, I know that the USAID created the META partnership with NASP, which was very important to target infrastructure investments in Africa. And I know that some of my New York pension funds have been involved, including the New York State Common Retirement and the New York City Employees Retirement Funds. And I think this is a tremendous initiative that moves in the right direction. And we, you know, oftentimes before when we want to divest from bad things, we want to make sure now we're investing in that regard. And so I'm a big supporter of initiatives like META. However, what my concern is, and what I think that will give us even greater, more investments, would be, is the fact that there's a lack of diversity and inclusion of small women and minorities in development finance opportunities at USAID and OPIC. So how can we do better? Because I think that diversity will help us more on the continent also in that regard.
Sure, thank you, Congressman. You're absolutely right. We at USAID believe we're facing immense challenges, of course, on the African continent, and we truly believe that those challenges cannot be addressed with USAID official development assistance alone. The private sector is absolutely critical to this. In fact, Administrator Green is actually rolling out a USAID private sector engagement policy as we speak. So this is something that is at the forefront of our vision for how USAID is going to be engaging with our African partners. So we fully agree with your vision as well.
I yield back, and I just do look forward to working with you, because we have some small minority and women-owned businesses that I know are very interested if we can work together on that.
Thank you very much. Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. And I'd like to start off, a couple of our colleagues have already talked about China. I know Mr. Sherman did, and I think Mr. Smith did as well. But Ambassador Naj, let me ask you this. If you were in a room with a number of, let's say African countries specifically, but they could be from other parts of the world, where they were really trying to decide whether it made sense to take advantage of the loans and opportunities that China is putting out there versus working with the United States or other countries, banks, et cetera. What would you tell, and we've already talked about some of this, but what would you tell them to look out for with China versus why it makes sense to work with the U.S. or the West?
Thank you very much for that question. What I would tell them to look out for is number one, are they going to bring over every single employee above turning a shovel from China instead of hiring locally? How much technology and professional transfer will there be when the project is done? How good is the quality of the work that will be done? Will they also bring over shopkeepers who will open up shops to service the company's employees, who will then displace African mom and shop keepers? And when everything is done, how much debt will there be left? And by the way, what will the environmental impact be? Will there also be wildlife trafficking or maybe timber cutting in addition to that? So I would urge them to look at the entirety of the project and what will be the true benefits, not only to putting down that road, but to the country at large.
Thank you. And having seen and followed this closely firsthand for quite a few years now, what do you, if they said, well, what do you think on these things will happen? What would you expect? Could you answer those questions that you just asked, what's likely to happen?
Well, I think that there is, as I said, a shift in perceptions of the type of projects that they provide. I just have to tell you, one of the things that really, really irritated me during my trips to Africa is you go to an African city and there's a stadium invariably built by the Chinese. And then the people say to me, well, you know, what do the Americans do? I say, well, what about the millions and millions of people we keep alive because of PEPFAR? What about the tremendous educational programs that we have done to educate the young people? And as I mentioned before, the young people in Africa really do get this. They want American companies. They want the type of expertise Americans have. They want the transfer. So I'm actually very encouraged by the future. And I think that this BUILD Act will now really give our businesses some weapons to compete fairly.
Thank you very much. Ms. Bass was asking a question before about, and you were talking about the free trade agreements, bilateral, because I know the administration, bilateral are more appealing than regional deals. I understand that. I'm basically a free trader, and I'll accept both. But getting back to the bilateral agreements in sub-Saharan Africa, you were about to say, I think, what countries are we kind of working with or thinking about, and then she had a limited amount of time, so you never really got into that. What countries are we talking about?
Can I respectfully not mention them yet, because we haven't really fully engaged on that yet, so we're at the point of actually just looking at possibilities, and I would not like to offset progress before we can start.
How many are we talking about?
At least 4 have come forward, and then there are a couple of others that we would like to look at on our own.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
We mentioned, I think briefly before Mishemani in Uganda too. My very first CODEL was back in 1997, and one of the countries we visited was Uganda, and I remember particularly memorable because Lady Di happened to die while we were on that version. So I remember specifically when this was. And I remember Museveni at that time was being talked about as, you know, the new African leaders, and he'd been in office, what, 12 years or so then. So he was getting a little long in the tooth at that point. Well, we're 2 decades later. And don't get me wrong, I think compared with previous and obviously in Uganda, what a breath of fresh air. It's been there a while now. Could you comment on that without asking a specific question about?
Absolutely. I have to tell you, sir, that actually Museveni was one of my early heroes because of his willingness to engage on HIV/AIDS when others were not. And at that time, Uganda's ABC strategy was the world leader in confronting HIV/AIDS. And also, he did quite a lot of empowering women politically in Uganda. Unfortunately, that was decades ago, and the decades go on, and at some point, leaders have to consider political transitions. And right now, there seems to be an awful lot of focus on keeping in power instead of the future of Uganda.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
My time's expired. The gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Sierra, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. First, I'd like to thank the chairman. He's not here, but 26 years of service, always in a bipartisan fashion in this committee, and I just want to thank him, even though he's not here. Mr. Ambassador, today, you know, I sit here and I listen to all the things that you have said, all the things that you're accomplishing, and I can only imagine it must be a very difficult job for you to do, especially with the rhetoric coming out of the White House. When he calls shithole countries, you know, he calls people from Western Hemisphere criminals, sick, and everything else. When you get off the plane, how do you deal with that? I mean, do you ignore what the president says? I don't want to put you on the spot. You don't have to answer if you don't want to. But I got to tell you, it's got to be very difficult for you getting off a plane and trying to work these deals.
Congressman, I have to be absolutely honest. I have never had a problem getting off the plane because I engage and talk about the wonderful things that America as a whole is doing, and also talk about Africa as one of the leading nonpartisan issues of our day, and you know, programs, involvement, engagement.
I mean, we all know China's effort in Africa and certainly in the Western Hemisphere. Basically, it's the same tactics. Would you say so? What they're doing in the Western Hemisphere in countries. I mean, I just read an article where in Panama, China bought a big piece of property, and what they're trying to do is build this warehouse to equal Amazon, and they want to be the Amazon of the Western Hemisphere. I guess the tactics are the same, and how do you coordinate, you know, fighting this?
I have to admit, and this is one of the things I told my African interlocutors, is that up to now I have not blamed them in dealing with China, because when there was a knock on the door for an investor and they opened it and only China was standing there, that's who they had to deal with. I want to make sure that the next time there's a knock on the door that there's American investors standing there as well, and that we can present what is more attractive about dealing with the United States of America. So I would like to be very aggressive in pursuing that, sir.
And in terms of, you're talking free trade, and again, the rhetoric out of the White House seems to be, let's look inward, not let's look outward. I mean, it's just, to me, it's, you know, 2 and 2 don't really add to 4 with this particular administration.
Well, I get a lot of support from the White House on expanding the free trade agenda and on engaging U.S. businesses in Africa, so I can tell you that that is my experience, sir.
All right. I won't put you on the spot anymore. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Would my friend yield?
Absolutely.
I thank my friend. Mr. Ambassador Nagy, I appreciate the diplomatic skill with which you answered my friend from New Jersey. But that White House support certainly doesn't extend to AIDS programming in Africa. I mean, last year he cut it 37% in his budget, and this year he's cut it 33%. How do you explain that to African nations when you travel? We don't mean it, we're kidding, we're counting on Congress to restore it, don't read anything into it in terms of the value we put in the relationship or Africa, and what does it mean in terms of the void it creates vis-a-vis China that has 40-fold increased its trade posture vis-a-vis Africa in the last 20 years? Mr. Day.
Thank you, Congressman. I would also echo Assistant Secretary Naj's comments in that every time I'm on the continent, USAID and our officials are welcomed with open arms, and that's, I think, a reflection of the 7 decades.
Mr. Day, excuse me, that really was not my question. I've been to Africa too. I know AID very well. I helped write the last foreign aid bill passed by Congress in 1985. I've been around a while. My question wasn't, are you welcome? My question was, how do you explain the fact that the administration you represent cut their budget 37% last year and another 33% this year? We didn't go along with it because we actually see the primacy of the relationship and the fact that's the world's fastest growing market. But nonetheless, a statement of values is being made to those African countries. And I'm asking how you handle that on the ground. I'm building on the question my friend Mr. Sirius asked Ambassador Nagy.
Congressman, at USAID, we are laser focused on ensuring that taxpayer investments on the African continent are deployed in the most efficient and effective manner and to the benefit of the American people and the African people as well.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Well, thank God, because I don't know what that answer meant.
I thought it was a great answer. The gentleman from South Carolina.
I bet you did.
Mr. Wilson is recognized for 5
And
minutes.
thank you, Mr. Chabot. And I want to join with everyone commending Chairman Royce for his service. It's really an indication of our appreciation of his service. The portrait, which is hanging up front, which indicates, again, what an extraordinary person Ed and his wife Marie have been on behalf of our country. And Ambassador, thank you for being here. Mr. Day, thank you. I saw your background with the IRI, International Republican Institute. I was a volunteer with IRI. I know what a difference it makes promoting freedom and democracy around the world. Also, your work now with USAID, with Administrator Mark Green, how incredible as we travel around the world. It's so impressive to see the signs, as I saw in rural Afghanistan, of a school that had been built by USAID, to see the food supplies being provided to the refugees in Sudan, to be present with Chairman Royce in Tacloban, the Philippines, to see the recovery efforts for persons from Super Typhoon. USAID makes such a difference, and I hope more American citizens find out how significant it is. With that, Ambassador, this year has been very hopeful, with Ethiopia and Eritrea signing an agreement in September that ended the 20-year conflict and reopened land crossings to allow people and goods to move freely between the countries. What a remark! 20-year war concluded. To what extent can the very positive reforms implemented by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed in Ethiopia have toward assisting internal challenges in Eritrea?
Indeed, sir, the changes have been incredible. In my 40 years of following Africa, I don't think I've ever seen anything that positive. And I'd like to assure you that the United States government is engaged in the whole of government response to figure out how best we can support those openings, both on the internal side with Prime Minister Abiy opening political space for his own citizens, but also on the external side as literally waves of peace wash over the whole sub-region. And as Ethiopians like to say, they're renaming the Horn of Africa to the Hope of Africa. And in many respects, that's a true characterization. So we're sending teams to engage directly with different components of the government, and we have been invited to engage with many sectors and institutions in Ethiopia to help rebuild them in a non-corrupt, totally different model. Thank you, sir.
Well, again, your positive attitude just is reflected by the Hope of Africa. That's great. Additionally, what are the prospects for reestablishing diplomatic relations between Eritrea and the United States?
Sir, thank you for the question. As I said when I was in Eritrea, my dream is to eventually, for the United States to have the same positive relations with Eritrea that we have with Ethiopia now. We've started the first steps. We'll continue the steps, and hopefully it'll lead there. We still have some outstanding bilateral issues, which they very well know, but we'll deal with them one at a time. And it's a very valuable country to have as a friend, and we look forward to that, sir.
Well, again, it's just been so hopeful to see the developments in Ethiopia and now Eritrea too, hopefully. Next, what's the extent of African-based terrorist groups What challenges do they have as a direct threat to the American people?
Thank you, sir. The problem with those terrorist groups are as they occupy space which is not occupied by government, it gives them freedom of action. And they may start off as local terrorist groups, but as we can see that they can then develop into interregional and even intercontinental types of terrorist groups, especially once they affiliate with global ISIS or Al-Qaeda. So they present an imminent and a long-term danger, sir.
And we saw, sadly, the attack last night in Strasbourg.
Exactly.
And so we need to be ever vigilant. And with that, what more can the United States, working with our African partners, do to prevent the spread of extremist ideologies, to protect the people of Africa and around the world?
Sir, that involves what we are doing is closely working with the African states, with outside interested parties such as France, the European Union, the United Kingdom, African Union, and the United Nations, and with the various UN peacekeeping forces, because they are an imminent threat, sir.
Well, again, thank you for your efforts, and the thought of having the agreements between Eritrea and Ethiopia, which would have been unimaginable, have occurred. So best wishes for continued success. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Cicilline, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, want to begin by thanking outgoing Chairman Royce for his extraordinary leadership of this committee and the bipartisanship which he has always demonstrated. And I hope the letter that you sent to us about your tenure as chairman, you will make an official part of the record, because I think it really recounts in a very meaningful way the great work that has been done under your leadership. And I just want to thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. Thank you to our witnesses. Ambassador Nagy, I'd like to start with you. As I'm sure you are aware, UN peacekeeping missions are currently deployed in several countries on the African continent, including South Sudan, Mali, Central African Republic, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, where they work to promote stability in conflict-torn societies, protect civilians from violence, and facilitate humanitarian assistance to communities in need, as well as monitoring human rights abuses and supporting the rule of law and the creation of democratic institutions. The UN successfully wound down 2 peacekeeping missions in Liberia and Cote d'Ivoire just this year. The United States has long supported UN peacekeeping operations as a cost-effective method of conflict mitigation that helps prevent fragile states from collapsing, keeps civil wars from morphing into unwieldy regional disputes, and creating the conditions necessary for long-term sustainable peace. In fact, the GAO recently found that UN peacekeeping missions are 8 times more cost-effective than a unilateral U.S. military engagement. Yet Secretary Pompeo recently made some troubling assertions about UN peacekeeping missions, claiming that they drag on for decades and bring us no closer to peace. I'd certainly welcome a clarification on the Secretary's remarks, and specifically, my first question is, does the Trump administration, which has voted to renew the mandates of 12 UN peacekeeping missions since it took office, still find value in their work?
Thank you very much, Congressman. Yes, absolutely. There are phenomenally effective UN peacekeeping missions. Then there are some others that may be less effective, and I think that is the whole focus of the administration, is to evaluate each mission on its own terms to see if it is accomplishing its tasks, or if it's not, do the tasks need to be realigned? For example, I would like to point to the one in Mali. In February, the Secretary General, the UN Secretary General, will be issuing a report specifically on how that peacekeeping mission is achieving its mandate, and we'll take a look to see if it needs to be modified or adjusted or whatever else needs to be done, because as you know, sir, Mali is in a very critical situation, and there are a number of other peacekeeping missions like that. So absolutely, I agree with you totally, even though, you know, we're paying, I think right now, 28% of the total cost of peacekeeping missions. Some are phenomenal.
At a fraction of the cost of what it would be if it were military engagement, obviously.
Absolutely.
I hope you will share those strong sentiments with Secretary of State Pompeo. Do you see, Mr. Ambassador, any missions today that you think should close?
Not any today, sir.
Okay. Thank you. As you are aware, the UN peacekeeping mission to Liberia wound down this year after nearly 15 years in that country. Would you characterize that mission as a success? And can you also tell us what assistance the U.S. is currently providing bilaterally to continue the progress and the momentum in Liberia?
I would consider that one a success, absolutely, and because I remember when it started under ECOWAS and then it transgressed to the UN, but I'll turn that over to my colleague from USAID for what we're doing, continue to support the country.
Sure. Thank you, Congressman. We, of course, have had a tremendous partnership with the Liberian government for a number of years, and we have a robust program based in Monrovia, everything from humanitarian assistance to health to supporting civil society, democratic governance. There are still tremendous challenges, of course. Extreme poverty is one of the major issues that we're dealing with, but we have a good partner in the Liberian government, and the new president, President Weah, has been actively engaged with USAID programs, and so where we have good partners and good partnerships, we feel like USAID programs are the most successful. So we have a very good partnership with the government of Liberia.
And finally, if I'd ask both of you to comment on the current status of our work in the Central African Republic. I traveled there at a time where I think it was sort of a very critical moment, and either progress could continue or there could be a significant retreat of that. And I know there's also been some new reporting that the Russians have engaged in a significant way. So if you could each share the current status of CAR.
From the USAID perspective, we're primarily focused on health and humanitarian assistance for the people of CAR.
From the diplomatic perspective, we are really, really encouraging the African Union to be hyper engaged in the peace process there, because the Russians are looking at the Central African Republic as an opportunity, and they are very much trying to work into a parallel peace process to put themselves forward. So we really are calling on the African Union to be very engaged and to make sure that there's only peace process to bring the country back. Sir.
Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, gentleman's time has expired. It was noted earlier today, it's the last Foreign Affairs Committee meeting for a number of members of this committee, and one of those is Darrell Ice from California, who I would just note for the record has been an extremely valuable and thoughtful member of this committee for a long time, and thank him for his service as well. And the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. That's very kind. It's been a quick 18 years. But I'm leaving it with good people behind, and this committee, I'm sure, will function next Congress in the same bipartisan way it has for so many years. I've got a bunch of questions, and let me try to go through them. The first one is an umbrella one. With Ex-Im Bank currently not able to fully function, with good intention by USAID and the funding you have, obviously, USTDA could be mentioned in that group, and OPIC. All of it together in Africa, if you had to say what is our effort worth and what is China's effort worth in dollars and capability, how would you measure those, our dollars and capability, their dollars and capability, based on the effort they're placing and the money they're putting in? Mr. Day, you probably, Secretary, you probably see it every day.
Thank you, Congressman. I said that is an excellent question. I think when we think about how USAID and the Americans engage with our partners on the African continent compared to other potential.
No, I want you to answer that. I fully buy that we go in there giving. We go in there with a real effort to develop countries and their own independence. We go in there as a gift to the rest of the world for safety and security. And perhaps the Chinese have a different intent. But I want people to understand, for the record, if we're looking at the size of the Army, so to speak, the size of the guns, the size of the programs coming in from just China, there are other players, Russia and so on, and their effort in dollars and capacity, regardless of our good intention and regardless of the goodwill we have, what are you faced with, their efforts, your efforts, and some of the results?
From a cash perspective, in terms of infusion into the African continent, we are not on the same level with China. However, the value, the superior value
Meaning,
proposition.
we give more almost anywhere in the world, but they put more into Africa in dollars.
In cash dollars. However, the superior value proposition of American innovation and American companies investing and two-way trade between Africa and the U.S., I don't think that's a comparison either. I would put my money on America every day.
Well, and that is one follow-up question that I've been keenly looking at for many months. The difference in a country which goes to, quote, based on, if you will, the 20 or 30-year cost of building out, and particularly Power Africa, if they go out based on lowest initial cost, isn't it true that China wins every time? And if they go out based on what's going to happen over the life of those loans and support and maintenance, that in fact many Western countries, including the United States, almost always would be better choices. Is that a fair statement?
I believe that's a fair statement.
So one of the questions I have, because you know, a lot of what we do as America is to help people temporarily, but we always use that term that if you teach someone how to fish, they will be fed for a lifetime. What are the winning programs in Africa that you either have or want to have that are funded, but you might want to have funded more to teach them how to fish so that the decisions and the programs and the long-term Power Africa are sustainable and go further? What is it that we need to do?
You know, you're absolutely right. I think Power Africa is probably a shining example of a successful program in Africa that really catalyzes American investment. I certainly believe that a whole of government effort to coordinate all of the interagency resources, to bring those to bear, to actually go to our African partners and demonstrate the superior value proposition that the U.S. has, I think would be well received.
Okay, one last question, if I may. I was at the change of current leaders in Zimbabwe some time ago. You know, it's one of those things you only get to do every 36 years or so. We, the United States government, are currently keeping you out of Zimbabwe, either a little bit here and maybe more for the record. What is it that you could accomplish if you were allowed to come up with systems that would isolate the current government from aid or programs, but at the same time would have some positive? You know, you are engaged in war-torn countries, you're engaged in other dictatorships. Zimbabwe uses only $20 bills for their money, and they have been cut off from everyone except basically the South Africans for a long time. So let me rephrase that. The Chinese are actively in there. But would you give me for that particular country, because I was so recently there?
Sure. Yes, sir. Interestingly enough, we had a trade delegation from Zimbabwe not long ago visit here, and they were warmly welcomed. They had some of the government ministers with them, and we told them exactly, as did I in my meetings with the high-level officials, if they could take a couple of steps, then we could start reevaluating our whole relationship, because Zimbabwe has phenomenal potential. And I am passionate about Zimbabwe because my triplets were born there, and I know what the country can do. So they could very quickly return to a prosperous path if the government would just, they're saying the right things. It would be nice if they actually did some of the things that they're talking about. But I think the United States business community would stand ready to engage with them very quickly, because there are a number of sectors where we could have very fruitful relations.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you. And if you would just, for the record, share with us, if you can, the request you made that would allow for that.
Is that okay, sir?
Yes.
All right, sir.
Briefly.
Yes, very, very quickly. There's two acts that they have passed. One is the Public Order and Security Act, and the other is the Access to Information Protection and Privacy Act, which if they would just withdraw those, that would be quite significant.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Another gentleman from California, Mr. Barra, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman. And I'll echo the remarks of our colleagues with thanks to Chairman Royce's as he moves on to his next endeavors, as well as the other members of this committee. And certainly with incoming Chairman Elliot Engel, hopefully we will continue to operate in a bipartisan way. I also, while I disagree with the President's approach to foreign policy, I appreciate the lifetime of service of our diplomats and our aid and development workers around the world. So, applaud the work that both of you are doing. We've had Ambassador Green in front of this committee at several times, and I do think USAID is moving in the right direction, looking at capacity building, and certainly expect Congress to support that. So given, we've talked about the potential in Africa. If I were to just frame the challenges that we see, we obviously see a tremendous youth bulge that is occurring. 30,000 Africans entering the job market on a daily basis. That's a tremendous challenge. We see millions of people displaced throughout Africa. We see future challenges of food and water insecurity on the continent, which will continue to create some instability. I was just in Sierra Leone, a fledgling democracy that is coming out of years of civil war. Had tremendous challenges with the West African Ebola crisis, where we are engaged. But I would say I saw more Chinese while I was there as well, which again presents a challenge that many of my colleagues have talked about. So we're framing the challenges, but I'm an optimist, and we've been spending some time trying to understand how PEPFAR came about being in a Republican administration with Democratic members of Congress, and really underlying that was a national security threat assessment that if millions of people died of HIV/AIDS, it would create massive instability on that and create governmental instability. And what we've just laid out, suggests that if we don't take a long-term view at these challenges in Africa, you'll continue to have an unstable continent. I think my question to both of you is, as Congress reasserts its authority, and members of Congress tend to be here longer than one administration to another, we have to take a nonpartisan approach to looking at Africa in the long term, and often we don't. We shift from one administration to the next. What would, if we were looking at long-term strategies, what would that time frame look like? And then what would, if you were recommending Congress looking at what the foundational strategies would be for the continent, what would you recommend our focus be? And I think the BUILD Act is a real strong first step.
Exactly, sir. I want to, again, congratulate the Congress for the BUILD Act, because that has strengthened my talking points when I go to Africa. The other one I would really point to is the Young African Leaders Initiative, because as you said, sir, Africa's future is its youth, and there's going to be millions and millions and millions of young Africans that are going to be wanting good jobs, and if they don't get them, they will either go to Europe or choose a very destructive path. So programs such as that, I have found to be so successful, because everywhere I go to visit in Africa, I run into the Young African Leaders Initiative network, and those people are so dynamic, so entrepreneurial, and we are teaching exactly the skills that the future Africa will need.
Programs like that don't require a lot of taxpayer dollars, and in fact, they're
no, they don't.
Building.
No, they're just phenomenal programs. So those are the two that how we can encourage foreign direct investment from U.S. businesses, and how we can build on this huge youth bulge to make sure that they look to the Western models for the future and not other places.
And then, Mr. Day, if I could just ask a quick question. As we think about aid and development in the 21st century, we've already touched on it won't just be U.S. taxpayer dollars. It'll be trying to leverage private investment, public investment, and then also working with the international community as well. And if you could just briefly give a vision of what you think aid and development looks like in the 21st century.
Thank you, Congressman. I think Administrator Green has laid out a very clear vision for how he views USAID's future, and that future is what we term the journey to self-reliance, which is working with our African partners to help them on their path towards self-reliance, which we ultimately define as their ability to plan, finance, and implement their own development solutions to their own challenges. And so if we have the level of commitment, which is so critical, and we have a good partner on the ground, then in many cases, our programs are more successful, we get much better results. And so the private sector is absolutely a critical component of this, but it's also important that we have good partners on the ground. And in many cases we do, in some cases we do not.
Great. My time's expired.
We'll go to Mr. Mike McCall of Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just got out of my monthly threat briefing as Chairman of Homeland Security, and I think the good news is that in the last, in 2016, the threat from ISIS was extreme. External operations, we were arresting one per week in the United States, it seemed like. And I think over the last 2 years, we have crushed them and the so-called caliphate. But the threat hasn't completely gone away. I think the good news is it's been downgraded to some extent, but then they've moved. They're still maybe in the Euphrates area, but the threat seems to be emerging more in Africa. And so I know there are about 10,000 ISIS and Al-Qaeda jihadists in Africa today. To put that in perspective, before 9/11, there were about 100 Al-Qaeda that existed. So it concerns me, I think, and I look forward to next Congress in this committee focusing on this issue, because I think we're going to be looking at foreign adversary nation states, but I think the threat of radical Islamist terror is going to be more focused in northern Africa and the Sahel. Then Congressman Pompeo and I, we traveled to Sinai and the Egyptian Sinai Peninsula. Camp North, they evacuated it the day we left due to the threat. We were in Tunisia, got briefed by the Libyan team in exile. It's very much a hot threat there, and it's very hot in the Sahel region. We passed, thanks to the chairman, my Trans-Sahara Counterterrorism Partnership Act out of this committee, which authorizes a program that y'all are working on. I think it's very valuable. And I just wanted to maybe just get your general assessment of what I'm talking about in terms of the threat in Africa, and what can we do. And we also passed a Fragility of States bill, which I think deals with fragile nations where terrorism can breed out of. Can you kind of talk about holistically what the State Department's doing to counter this threat?
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. Indeed, the threat is increasing in Africa, especially in the Sahelian region. A whole number of reasons, which would take a long time to discuss. But basically, the fundamental issue remains, we can get rid of the terrorists thanks to the efficiency of forces and allies and people that we're with. But once you get rid of the terrorists, you have to fill that space with the government, because if you don't, then another group of terrorists will come along, which is in many cases worse than the last group, which is exactly what had happened in Somalia up to now. So we are working very, very closely with the French, with the Malians, with the Nigerians, with the Chadians, with this new G5 force that 5 of the countries have set up, and we're supporting them exactly so that not only is it a military campaign, but it's also a governance campaign that once you recapture territory, then you do start providing the services that the people demand, so it's not another terrorist group that comes along and does the exact same thing, sir.
I agree. I think Libya is a good example where even the military can't get, you got General Haftar in the east and one in the west, and they can't get, if you have no military, you have no governance. And so it's a big problem there. Mr. Day?
I certainly agree with the Assistant Secretary's comments, particularly in the Sahel. There are just chronic vulnerabilities, water scarcity, low access to education, low access to health services, and we think that this is absolutely critical to address. And so we have robust programs throughout the region, particularly in Burkina Faso and Niger. That's where our best partnerships are. But we continue to be very concerned about the situation.
Well, thank you, and I look forward to addressing this again next Congress. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to yield back the balance of my time.
Well, thank you, Mr. McCall. Thanks for introducing that resolution for wildlife trafficking and rhino horn in China. I think keeping Beijing engaged on this issue is important.
And with the gentleman yield, I think that's another issue where they illegally they sell rhinos and wildlife, and then it's a terror financing operation. And so I look forward to. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, we appreciate the fact that when we put the legislation forward to abolish the ivory trade, that Beijing stepped up and closed those carving stations. But keeping the pressure on is going to be important. We go to Lois Frankel of Florida.
Thank you. It's sort of sad that I say thank you, Mr. Chair, to you, Mr. Royce, for the last time here. I just want to thank you. It's been such an honor and a pleasure to serve with you. And I think it is very fitting. I think of how many times I have ended up being here with you at the end and with hardly anyone around.
Yes.
So, but I think
you always saw these hearings through, and thank you, Lois.
And so did you. And I want to thank you two gentlemen for the work that you do. I want to start with a story, and then I'll make a point. And it's the story of a 30-year-old HIV-positive mother of two living in Mozambique who lost her husband to AIDS last year, and she turned to a local clinic for help when she discovered she was HIV positive. The clinic gave her medicine to stay alive and healthy. Now, because of the expansion and expanded global gag rule, her clinic is one of dozens in Mozambique that have been forced to shut down, and she has nowhere to go. Now, I want to be kind to you because I don't think you invented this policy, but I am very alarmed. I am very worried about what is happening to women all over the world because some of the policies of the Trump administration. And I will say this, no matter what you want to talk about and talk about progress, if we don't advance girls and women, there will be no progress. There will not be economic progress. There will not be progress in security of the world. Now, I saw a chart that has shocked me, and this chart shows me what the Trump's global gag rule is doing. Now, what we've had other administrations have gag rules, which is basically they've prevented U.S. foreign aid for family planning to be cut off if even there's a mention of abortion or a referral to a service that does abortion. Now, under the Trump version, and that cut off $575 million in foreign aid, which is terrible. I don't think the original gag rules are good. I think it's inhumane, and I think it's stupid. All right, but here's Trump's version. It can cut up to $8.8 billion in U.S. foreign aid for health programs, including family planning, HIV, tuberculosis, malaria, maternal and child health, because it's cutting off funding to these entities, even if they, with their own money, either perform a legal abortion or they refer to a legal abortion or they give all the information that is necessary for a woman to understand what her choices are. And it would be absolutely, you would be outraged, I don't mean you personally, but we would be outraged, and we are, if women were forced to have abortions. That would be wrong and inhumane. But to force women to have children against their will is also, to me, inhumane. And now that's not all that's going on, though. I wish I could say that. The Trump administration has also cut off millions and millions of dollars in funding to the UN Population Fund, which works in 150 countries to provide critical services, including maternal care, treatment for survivors of sexual violence, and combating harmful practices like child marriage, genital mutilation. So, I mean, you can talk all day about advances, but if we're holding women back, we're pushing them back, there's not going to be advances. So I guess my question to you is, what is the replacement for all these maternal and women's health services that are being cut off?
Thank you, Congresswoman. And I certainly agree with you that for communities to progress, women and children must progress as well. That said, the U.S. remains by far the largest donor of global health programs in the world, and we remain committed to supporting the health of women and children. And we have programs all around the world. I'll certainly check on the particular issue in Mozambique, but ending child marriage, ending FGM, gender-based violence, these are all issues that USAID continues to have robust programs in support of all across the continent of Africa.
Well, just to finish up here, Mr. Chair, this is not a criticism of USAID, which does very, very good work. But from my point of view, the Trump administration has been eliminating many, many good partners. And what I would ask is that you bring back to this committee a full report as to who is making up the difference for all these programs that are potentially defunded because of the expansion of the global gag rule and because of the cutting off of the money to the UN Population Fund. And I thank you again for your service. And with that, Mr. Royce, I'm so sorry for the last time to yield back, but again, it's been an honor.
Congresswoman Frankel, it's been an honor for me to work with you. Thank you very much. And I want to thank Ted Yoho here because we've been talking about the BUILD Act. And as we've heard today, that is going to double your book of business and all the new authorities that you have there. I appreciate his travels to Africa, his work also in Asia, but on this BUILD Act, as a counterweight to Beijing, this is really critical. And I also thank him for his work on wildlife trafficking. And Congresswoman Frankel, thank you for your work and traveling with me on so many occasions. I really appreciated it. Congressman Yoho.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I too want to reiterate what everybody says, but I know I'm in good hands because I've got you looking right over my shoulder. Up there in the wall of the Foreign Affairs past chairman's looking over us, so I know we'll do well. We will miss you, and I thank you for your leadership and your mentorship. Moving on, it's apparent that the U.S. must be fully engaged in Africa, as the chairman stated in his opening statement, because if we do not, a void is created and grows as Africa grows, and others will fill that, primarily China, Russia, or terrorist organizations with the right lack of governance and all that, they can expand as we've seen. And with Boko Haram, there's 2 million people displaced because of them. And so that void has to be filled. But how we engage matters, and I know you'll agree with that. We can engage post-breakdown of societies or not the development of societies, or then conflicts are there, and it's a rougher way to go in there to try to fix something that's broken, or we can be proactive and help direct the direction of those countries to be able to fulfill the needs of what those wants are in that country. And the best way is through smart investments and infrastructure leading to economic development. And to develop those countries, it's essential that we move. And Mr. Day, I heard you talking about transitioning from the aid and trade, and our mantra has been saying we want to transition countries from aid to trade as quick as we can. And if we look at our top 15 trading partners, of those, 12 of them were once recipients of foreign aid. Saying that, my questions are, recognizing the diversity among African countries, what is your assessment on the region's economic growth, and how do you choose the best country to work with? We'll start with you, Ambassador Nagy.
How do we choose the best countries to work with? That would come through our engagement with them on which countries are really, really ready to move forward and to accept the types of business environments which exactly you were talking about, low levels of corruption, being really interested in their own people bilaterally, but also there's another factor because the regions also matter. And this time, I'm really, really encouraged because the MCC is able to do regional projects. So that is also very important because Africa's natural units are, in fact, its regions because of the old colonial boundaries.
Right.
That often regions make a lot more sense. So we can really engage to see which of the regions are ready, which of the countries are really ready to move forward to put in the policies and priorities which will benefit their own people.
It perplexes me because we look over there and there's places that don't have water, they don't have electricity. This is the 21st century. We know how to do these. And what we see prohibiting that are bad government or,
Yes.
you know, the despots that they don't care about the people, they care about their personal gain. We can't fix every country today, but if we can build on the success, and you were talking about this, the mission in Liberia was a success. And we know success breeds success. So how can we build around countries in that same area, in that same region, that say, I want what they have, and we're willing to come to the table and do what we have to. Are you finding that? Mr. Day, we'll ask you.
We are, the short answer. And I think also to answer your question about how do we choose, how USAID engages with our partners on the ground, USAID is all part of the journey to self-reliance, but part of that is we want to be more data-driven in our decision-making. In fact, we've developed these self-reliance roadmaps that actually can bring together 17 third-party objective open source data sources so that we can have a better picture as to where these countries are on that path, and then also helps us guide some of those investments. It's not determinative, but it's a conversation starter and a tool that we use.
Okay. We wanted, when we started to draft the BUILD Act, our goal was to move countries from aid to trade.
Yeah.
We wanted to build on the OPEC model, that's return money to the American taxpayers 40 out of 41 years. How will the BUILD Act improve U.S. companies' competitiveness in Africa, and what should their key areas of focus be as they look to better support U.S. companies? And I've only got a few seconds.
With each country, that'll be different, sir, because in some, for example, the tourism sector could really, really, be exploited to create work. Others, it's agricultural development and productivity and processing. So it depends country to country. But thanks to the BUILD Act, it's a wide spectrum. And again, I heard that from American business community and the African leaders themselves.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I take this opportunity to yield back to you for the last time, and it's been an honor.
It's been an honor, Mr. Yoho, to work with you. Ambassador Ann Wagner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for hosting this hearing. And I'll echo my colleagues. I cannot think of a more fitting way for you to close out your esteemed time and leadership on this committee than to reflect on the immense progress we have seen in relations between the United States and our African partners, and to chart paths towards future shared growth. Ambassador Nagy, I am deeply concerned about China's attempts to expand its control over the global cobalt market to African producers. It has recently come to my attention that China is now seeking to derail a U.S.-Cameroonian Memorandum of Understanding on cobalt production. This strikes me as a serious national security risk. Already, the U.S. military buys most of the cobalt it uses for guided missiles production from China. And frankly, a partnership on cobalt production with Cameroon would greatly benefit both countries. How is the State Department working with the Cameroonian government to get the Memorandum of Understanding back on track?
Thank you for the question. Unfortunately, I am not familiar with the issue, so I'll have to get back to you on that.
Mr. Day, anything?
I'll defer to the Assistant Secretary.
But can I just add one quick? During my last visit to West Africa, interestingly, the president of Guinea said that they had some potential cobalt there, and we're following up on that one.
We could use the extra partnership. It would be helpful to both, and I do not want China once again interfering in a very important memorandum of understanding. So moving on, my colleagues and I have long sought to counter Boko Haram's campaign to use unspeakable violence against schoolgirls to gain international notoriety. Last February, I was appalled to learn that Boko Haram had abducted 112 schoolgirls from a town in northeast Nigeria. While most were thankfully released a month later, one brave little girl, a 15-year-old Leah Sharibu, remains in captivity because she refused to abandon her Christian faith. Ambassador Nagy, how is the United States working to secure Leah's safe release?
Leah Sharibu definitely remains a priority for us. Our ambassador is seized with it, as is the rest of the mission. We bring her up, and as a matter of fact, President Buhari himself is following up on that on a continuous basis. One of the things that we have avoided is mentioning it too much in public, because then the value to the terrorists keeps going up. But I can assure you that we are working very energetically as much as possible to obtain her release.
Thank you. Although Rwanda's authoritarian government under Paul Kagame recently acquitted opposition leader Diane Rwigara of trumped-up charges brought against her, many worry that the government's intent is to intimidate its critics and political enemies. Mr. Day, what does Ms. Rwigara's acquittal mean for dissent and free speech in Rwanda?
You know, USAID has been working in Rwanda for quite some time, and with a wide variety of different programs. And you'll have to forgive me. I'll have to look into that particular issue. You know, our primary support has been for the Rwandan people. We certainly have been concerned with some of the closing spaces in Rwanda, but we continue to work with civil society and a variety of different groups to support the people of Rwanda so that they have a voice into their own future. But I will look into that particular issue.
Thank you. A few months after Emerson Mnangagwa replaced strongman Robert Mugabe as president of Zimbabwe, we have seen disappointingly few improvements. Mr. Day, what is the situation on the ground in Zimbabwe, and how does USAID support the growth of Zimbabwe's civil society?
I'll defer to the Assistant Secretary on the political analysis, but similar to Rwanda, we're certainly very concerned about the political situation in Zimbabwe in terms of an operating space. Our priority, of course, continues to be the support of the Zimbabwean people who have been under tremendous distress for a number of decades. And so our programs are focused on humanitarian assistance and supporting civil society so they, again, can have a voice in their own.
Thank you. Ambassador Nagy?
Yes, ma'am. On the ground, the Zimbabwean government is saying some fairly positive things, but we're still waiting for some action on the two laws that I mentioned previously.
Right. All right. Well, thank you. I look forward to some responses to some of the questions that I had, and I appreciate your service and your time today. Mr. Chairman, I also, for the last time, yield back. It has been an honor and a privilege to work with you here in Congress.
Thank you, Ambassador. We go to John Curtis of Utah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would, like many of my colleagues, like to emphasize two themes that we've heard throughout these hearings. One is thank you for your service. It's been an honor to be the youngest member of your committee and to be here. The second theme is this influence of China, and I think you have adequately answered this over and over in today's hearing, so I'm not going to really ask you a question other than to join my colleagues in expressing concern and acknowledging that despite the amazing work that we do, the over $8 billion of investment that we make there, that sometimes China comes in and negates all of that with these tempting short-term offers. And so just add my voice to the concern and the reality of that. Usually around the globe you see as a partner in crime Russia. In many regions, and we haven't really touched on that. Could you share with us the influence of Russia on the continent and tell us what concerns you have there?
Thank you very much. Exactly right. Russia, while in no way bringing the amount of resources that China has, they are trying to be very opportunistic and transactional, where for a low investment, they can maximize their influence. I point specifically to the Central African Republic, where the Russians used an authorization from the UN Security Council to provide some weapons to the Central African government to bring in several hundred private security people. Now the president's security advisor is a Russian. The Russians have trained the Presidential Guard. They are also exploiting some mineral resources. So they have inserted themselves into the Central African Republic at relatively low cost. Those are the types of opportunities that they're looking at, and they will continue looking at, and we have to be very vigilant and monitor their activities closely, sir.
Thank you. Botswana is home to a large population, or a high percentage of the elephants in the region. And we talked, and you've referred a little bit to the illegal hunting and problems that we've had. And we've had almost no discussion about potential legal opportunities there. And the ban on elephant hunting is viewed in many regions in Botswana as harmful. Some of the economic development of these small villages is dependent, was dependent on that. And so while the illegal trafficking is going on, we've kind of shut this down. The folks on the ground will tell you they don't mind reasonable restrictions based on scientific data, but that there's been almost no scientific data put behind the ban. What role would be appropriate for the United States in determining what's good for legal harvesting of elephants in the region?
I'm happy to look into the issue and get back to you. The only thing I will say is that we have had a long-standing and good partnership with the Botswanan government, and we have robust wildlife trafficking programs. Our programs, particularly in Botswana, have been focused on HIV and AIDS, but I'll look into the particular issue of them.
Thank you. I walked in, I was here for almost all 2.5 hours of the hearing, but stepped out for a moment, and when I came back in, you were talking about Rwanda. And so I don't know if you touched on this while I was gone, but if not, could you address the problem with the closing of the churches? And Rwanda's made so much progress, it seems to be a step backward. Is that on the radar of the administration, and are we seeing some improvements there?
It is. We have not seen any improvements lately, but it's very much on the radar screen of the administration, because we believe that that particular law was very counterproductive. We understand the purpose that they were trying to get at, but we felt that the mechanism was totally wrong, because it was infringing on freedom of religion instead of, if there's a problem with certain churches that are breaking the law or are not real churches, then you use the law to affect them, not with a sledgehammer.
That's what it felt like. My final question is that oftentimes in these voids of certainty and disruption, you'll find ISIS and Al-Qaeda. We haven't talked about that much today. Can you tell us what you're seeing in the region with the growth of these terrorist organizations, and what we need to be looking for?
Absolutely. Both of those are very opportunistic, and different terrorist groups in Africa have aligned themselves with one or the other global organizations. And sometimes they do that as a mark of, trying to be recognized. And other times, for example, the new group that has crept up in Mozambique are also calling themselves that, even though there is absolutely no ties to them. But as I mentioned before, it's the terrorist threat is growing. It's becoming much more serious. It's creeping into places and countries where it has not existed before. That's why we have to be very, very active and engaging with international partners, with the African countries, and all of our friends to confront them wherever they exist. Mozambique's a good example, because it has just started, and there's still an opportunity to stop it in its infancy. So it's critically important to give it attention there, not to let happen what happened with, say, Boko Haram, sir.
Good. Thank you. I'm out of time. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much, John. We go now to Mr. Ted Poe of Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to echo my colleagues' comments. Thank you for chairing this committee for so many years. Been a wonderful privilege to be here with you. We're both leaving Congress. I'm back to Texas, and you're back to the foreign country of California, and it's been a pleasure working with you, and best wishes in the future. I think the country is better because of your leadership over the last 6 years, and even longer than that. You chaired the same subcommittee that I'm chairing, the Terrorism Subcommittee, and so thank you on behalf of the people of Texas for your leadership in foreign affairs. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you, Judge. I might come see you sometime in the winter in Texas.
You're always welcome. You're always welcome, sir. Gentlemen, thank you for being here. I want to cut right to the chase. Wildlife trafficking in Africa is a great concern, especially as I see things taking place. And it's not getting better for the animals. You have corruption with governments in Africa. You have the slaughter of rhinos for their horns. The horns, I understand, are grounded down into powder and shipped illegally to Vietnam. You have the elephants and the tusk being sold in China on the illegal market. But the bottom line is, you got the disappearance of wildlife in Africa that may become extinct. My 12 grandkids, it may be the only time they see rhinos or elephants are in Disney movies or Disney cartoons in the future, and I'm not being facetious. So, what is the plan to improve that situation, especially in those two areas, those two animals?
Thank you, Congressman. As you said, this is an absolutely critical issue. Biodiversity conservation is absolutely critical to the health of African communities. USAID has prioritized this issue and will continue to do so. 25% of the agency's biodiversity funding goes directly towards wildlife trafficking. We have 65 projects in 25 countries. And so it's something that we work tirelessly at protecting.
Excuse me, Mr. Day.
Yep.
Are we winning or are we losing?
It is a complex issue, and it's
that means
tough
we're
one.
losing.
It's
We're
a tough
losing.
one.
Complex means we're losing. I'm not faulting you. I want to know, because this is I guess really the question is, what can we do better to make sure that these animals don't become extinct? What can we do? Congress, administration.
I think from our perspective, if we had greater engagement both at the host country level, the international donor community, as well as the private sector, as I mentioned earlier in the testimony, we can't do this without the engagement of the private sector. And that's not to say that they are not engaged now, but we do need more engagement from the private sector. We believe that's where the vast majority of the force and the power is going to come from.
And I agree with you on that, too, the private sector as well. Ambassador, do you want to weigh in on this?
The only thing I would add, sir, is that I think it's also critically important to engage local communities, because if you can persuade them of the value of the wildlife for their own livelihood, when it's tourism, economic development, and factors like that, then that helps us win that much easier, because the local folks know what's going on.
Well, it seems to me, I can understand why the bad things are happening. You got everybody involved. You got the local game wardens, if I can use that phrase, who make almost nothing a year, all of a sudden being given a bribe to look the other way while terrorists or whoever wants to kill animals on the property. And it just seems that the international community, especially the United States, needs to be directly involved in this before it's too late. And then we will wring our hands and say, oh, I wish we would have done something different in the past. I don't know if it's going after the Vietnamese government, going after the Chinese government, certainly going after the terrorists who are involved in doing this and getting rid of those do-bads, in my opinion. I would just hope that Congress, administration, the private, and God bless those private entities that are trying to do what they can to preserve animals. Is there any talk about, one last question, Mr. Chairman, any talk about removing those species from certain areas of Africa and relocating them somewhere else?
I would have to check on those types of discussions. I do know that that removal of certain species from certain areas is extraordinarily expensive, so I know there are resource issues there, but I'm happy to look into what the current discussions are.
I'd appreciate you getting back with me on that. We certainly can bring some of them to Texas. Be fine with me. I'm just speaking on my behalf. Thank you both, gentlemen. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, and that's just the way it is.
Well, thank you. I share the judge's sense of urgency on this. And I think that's why we need fully funded programs. That's why we need full diplomatic engagement. Also why we need state and Department of Defense, both working with the game wardens whose lives are on the line there in Africa, who are trying to stand off these poachers where they're outgunned and outnumbered. And so, but let me thank Ambassador Nagy and Mr. Day for being here to testify before us, and I hope the entire administration is listening to us today. Clearly, there is strong bipartisan support for well-resourced, broad engagement in Africa. We've got to be present there. We've got to continue our effort there to be active in Africa, to build partner capacity to combat terrorism, to foster trade and development, as the judge said, to end wildlife trafficking there, to strengthen health systems there, and of course to support good governance. Too much is at stake, too much for Americans, too much is at stake for Africans alike. And with that, this hearing is adjourned.